There are a lot of scholars who think that matriarchy doesn't exist in nature, but I follow on one of my fellow Minangkabau West Sumatra specialists, an anthropologist named Peggy Sande, who argues convincingly that a matriarchy would not be the mirror image of a patriarchy. You wouldn't have these, giant women walking around, smacking tiny little men around. That a matriarchy, if women were in control, what you'd end up getting is gender egalitarianism. And she argues that that is really what you see in West Sumatra. It's not that men don't have a role in politics. They actually have a central role in politics and in the lives of families, but that there's a lot of shared authority. And that's what you get when women are in control. Cognatic kinship, bilateral kinship, it's borrowing work from anthropology, but then applied historically, first by a scholar named Oliver Walters, in trying to define what makes Southeast Asia different from South Asia and from East Asia. And he says that there is a sort of a shared, not everywhere, but shared cognatic bilateral kinship where descent is reckoned through both the mother and the father's line. And that means that people are particularly attentive both to the mother's family and to the father's family. Historically, it's meant that women and women's families and a mother's family determined a lot of a child's own political authority. And maybe, and this is a big cautionary maybe, when we look at contemporary politics in Southeast Asia, we've seen just in the last decade or two a lot of women presidents. There's Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo in the Philippines. There's Megawati Sukarno-Putri in Indonesia. There's Aung San Suu Kyi now in Burma. And in all three cases, these are women presidents who've built in, almost artificially, into their own names, their fathers' names. And so it's a way of reminding us that authority can be passed down, not just from fathers to sons, but from fathers to daughters too. There are very strong patriarchal, patrilineal movements that tend to come out of reformist Islam historically, going back to at least the 1790s, and right now happening in West Sumatran society. Very aggressive political movements of Muslim men saying that we need to dismantle matrilineality. And that it has been consistently, always over time, resisted. These movements have always failed. Sometimes violently, usually more subtly. As soon as Indonesians began to become more political in a kind of a modern political sense in the early 20th century, there were strong women's movements. There was, I think, 1920s, maybe 1928 was the first big women's congress. Women had their own newspapers, and they were also working on men's newspapers as well. They were politically active. They were leaders. They were taking up arms against the colonial government. And Indonesia had the oldest, I think one of the oldest Asian communist parties and the largest communist party outside of the communist bloc by the 1960s. There was a woman's wing of the Indonesian Communist Party called Gerwani, and in 1965 there was this horrible event in Indonesian culture, probably the defining event of the 20th century for Indonesia, more than the Japanese occupation, more than Dutch colonialism. There was an attempted coup on the part of a small handful of communists where they kidnapped and murdered a bunch of right-wing, Western-leaning generals. They dumped their bodies down an abandoned well on an Air Force base in Jakarta and hoped that this enormous rank-and-file Communist Party would then rise up and spark a true revolution. That doesn't happen. What ends up happening is the then dictator, Suharto, moves fairly decisively. He locks the country down. He brings in his army divers. They dredge this well. They pull up these corpses. A few days in a tropical well has been bad for soft tissue. Eyeballs are missing, genitals are missing, and Suharto and the military concoct this story that these generals had been sexually mutilated in this frenzy, this bacchanal of Gurwani members, of Indonesian communist women, and it was this myth that was used as a pretext to engage in a campaign of the mass murder of communists that starts in late 1965, is really horrifying in 1966, and really continues up until the late 1960s, where anywhere between 500,000 to 2 million people are killed. And the fact that, we've got a margin of error of 1 million lets you know how horrific this was and how poorly history has covered it. Following that pretext, that myth that women plus politics equals murder, women were really, as much as possible, kept off the political stage in Indonesia throughout the Suharto regime, which only ended in 1998. The left wing is so thoroughly suppressed in Indonesia during the 1970s, 80s. A lot of the movements tend to be more centered on social reform than on actual political alternatives. But Indonesian women are active on the national stage. They're looking to Europe and to the United States and into Japan and to other places in Asia as sources of inspiration. They're very active.